January 24th, 2014, on a cold, foggy morning in Mexico, Miriam Rodriguez received a phone call. It was her eldest daughter speaking on the phone with her voice shaking. Miriam's worst nightmare had come true. Her 20-year-old daughter had been kidnapped by the Zetas, one of the most notorious cartels in Mexico, known for engaging in brutally violent activities such as torture, organized crime, and indiscriminate murder. Despite her relentless efforts to pay the ransom and secure her daughter's release, it all fell to no avail. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, and finally, the young kid was found in an abandoned ranch, dead and murdered in cold blood. They thought they had won, as it was just another day at the office, but they didn't know they had awakened something far more dangerous. Miriam would not rest. She became a hunter, and her quest to vengeance would become a story far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Miriam's worst nightmare. In the 1960s, Mexico was known for its cartel turf wars and escalating violence. It was during this time that our main character was born, Miriam Elizabeth Rodriguez Martinez. She grew up in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, where she lived a seemingly ordinary life. However, she and her family had to change location after a series of unfortunate cartel events ruined their location. Tamaulipas' stretches of dirt roads and scrubland made it an ideal drug smuggling corridor. In the early 2000s, Mexico was consumed by a violent surge in cartel activity. During this period, the murder rate tripled, with countless civilians either missing or fleeing their homes in terror. After so many years in Mexico, Miriam got used to life in the hood. Her second daughter, Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez, stayed behind in San Fernando to finish her education and help with her mother's business. Everything seemed normal until 2012, when tragedy struck. On a fateful day, 20-year-old Karen was driving her truck through a remote area when disaster struck. Two trucks encircled her, and armed men jumped out, dragging her from her vehicle and into theirs. The kidnappers took Karen to the Rodriguez family home, binding her as they laid their ransom plan. At 4 a.m. on January 24th, 2014, Miriam Rodriguez received a shocking call from her eldest daughter, Azalea. It turned out that Karen had been kidnapped by the Zetas cartel, one of the most feared criminal organizations in Mexico. At the time, the 54-year-old mother was working as a nanny for a wealthy family in McAllen, Texas, living under their roof. But the moment the news sank in, she sprang into action. She packed her bags, left a heartfelt goodbye note for her employers, and rushed to the international bridge in Nuevo Laredo, desperate to catch a bus to Tamaulipas, Mexico, where her family awaited her. As she traveled home, the weight of reality pressed down on her. Her 20-year-old daughter had become yet another victim of the infamous Zetas cartel, a fate that had befallen tens of thousands since the gang's brutal takeover of San Fernando in 2010. This staggering rise of kidnappings prompted banks to start offering loans specifically for ransoms, and more than a fifth of the population had either fled or vanished without a trace. The ransom trap. Now that Karen had been kidnapped, the Zetas demanded a heavy ransom for her life, making it clear they had no intention of hurting her. The couple was willing to pay any price to ensure their daughter's safety. Despite the family's desperate search and efforts, the nightmare only continued. Meanwhile, the Zetas have always been known to be from elite Mexican military defectors in the late 1990s and were infamous for their extreme violence tactics. In one of the bloodiest incidents of the drug war, the gang were responsible for killing 72 migrants, coldly gunning them down. Their first instinct was always to kill rather than negotiate. Generally, the Zetas thrived on violence, fueling Mexico's deadly turf wars as rival cartels, like the Tijuana and Sinaloa factions, fought for control of lucrative smuggling routes. These conflicts turned cities like San Fernando into battlegrounds, leaving mass casualties. Turf wars, ruthless battles over territory, were not just about drugs. Human trafficking, extortion, and cartel rivalries played a part too. In a world where lives were disposable, the Zetas set the standard for terror. Rival cartels even resorted to kidnappings and murders for revenge. For years, Mexico has been ravaged by this unchecked violence, leaving entire communities in fear and law enforcement struggling to keep up. The cartel's deadly reign threatened everyone in their path, and Miriam's family was no exception. The violent world they were trapped in was unforgiving, and Karen's abduction was just one piece of a much larger, blood-soaked reality. In a desperate bid to save their daughter, Miriam's husband, Luis, hurried to the bank. A respected store owner for over 2 decades, Luis had earned the trust of his community and had good credit. He secured an instant loan to cover the ransom as they gathered their life savings, totaling just under 110,000 Mexican pesos. The phone rang again. The kidnappers provided instructions for the drop-off location. Miriam and Louise arrived at the designated area, their hearts racing in anticipation. A Zetas member appeared to collect the ransom, but there was no sign of Karen. Instead, they were told she would be waiting in a nearby cemetery parking lot. It was a cruel twist of fate when they arrived and waited for hours. Karen never came. Miriam and her family were subjected to further extortion attempts month after month. Refusing to surrender to despair, Miriam insisted on a meeting with the gang members. They agreed to meet at a local restaurant called El Junior, where Miriam confronted a man who attempted to extract even more money from her, refusing to reveal Karen's whereabouts. The man, known as Sama, was unhelpful but wore a cheap plastic radio on his belt which emitted a constant stream of voices. Although he claimed he didn't have Karen, he offered to help locate her for a price. The Zetas, once a well-structured cartel, were now a fractured organization. Most of the original members were either dead or locked away, leaving behind a younger, more unpredictable generation. Perhaps Sama was telling the truth. Maybe some rogue members had taken Karen without the consent of their superiors. Filled with a mixture of hope and doubt, Miriam reluctantly paid the 28,000 pesos, only to be tricked into giving away another 7,000 pesos. A scam that left her feeling even more helpless. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, but Karen never returned. It was clear at this point she was never going to see her daughter again. This tragic realization marked the beginning of Miriam's relentless quest for justice, a vow to hunt down the people who had torn her family apart. This was the beginning of her transformation into a vigilante, driven by a fierce love for her child. A dangerous game. After numerous pleas for justice, the police refused to help the Rodriguez family. Now more determined than ever, Miriam's hunt led her back to Sama, the only member of the gang she had encountered. After a month without any word from the cartel or any sign of Karen, the cruel truth began to sink in. Her daughter was likely dead, and someone had to answer for it. Miriam pressed him for details about Karen's captors, gathering enough information to confirm Sama's involvement in her daughter's disappearance. In February 2014, desperation drove Miriam to call Lieutenant Alex, a Marine whose number she had received from a stranger on her bus ride to San Fernando. During their conversation, she discovered a slight difference between the Marines and the local police. The Marines were decisive and lethal, boasting an astonishing kill ratio of nearly 30-1. They were the same forces that had captured Mexico's most notorious drug lord, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. With that kind of power at her disposal, capturing a few low-level Zeta operatives seemed like child's play. Just days after that conversation, Miriam stumbled upon her first lead. She spotted 2 teenage girls in a plaza using Karen's laptop, which had been with her during the abduction. Without wasting a moment, she contacted Lieutenant Alex. In less than an hour, both girls were taken to a secure location where they revealed crucial information about the laptop and the Zetas. This led to the discovery of a kidnapping camp, where about a dozen captives were freed, but Karen was not among them. Miriam accompanied the Marines on their raid, her heart pounding as they pressed deeper into the site. Each step a desperate search for any trace of her daughter, Karen. Meanwhile, the soldiers who fell in the raid were merely a fraction of the crew responsible for Karen's abduction. Their deaths may have provided a measure of justice for the countless atrocities they had committed, but for Miriam, they represented lost witnesses. She needed them alive to uncover the truth about her daughter's fate. Miriam was determined to hold the Zetas accountable, to track them down, and ensure they paid for their crimes just as she had promised her daughter Azalea. More than anything, she wanted to understand why Karen had been taken and by whom. She needed answers. She needed to know where her daughter was. Days later, the hunt continued. Determined to find Sama, Miriam scoured the internet for any trace of the man she had met at the restaurant. Hours turned into days of searching until she stumbled upon a Facebook picture of a man who had a striking resemblance to Sama, standing next to a woman in an ice cream shop uniform. Further investigation revealed that the uniform belonged to a store in Ciudad Victoria, nearly 2 hours away from her home. Recognizing him from their encounter at El Jr., Miriam located an ice cream shop and began watching it closely. She memorized the working hours of the woman in the photo and bided her time, waiting for Sama to appear. Finally, the moment arrived. Miriam spotted Sama entering the store, and she followed the couple home, documenting their address. It felt intrusive, but for a mother seeking justice, it was a necessary risk. However, she knew this information alone couldn't be enough to involve the police. She needed to get closer. A few months earlier, during her investigation, Miriam had encountered a mechanic who worked on Karen's car the night before her abduction. Coincidentally, this mechanic had also been kidnapped by the Zetas, but was lucky enough to escape. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Miriam had always suspected Sama's involvement in her daughter's kidnapping, even if he faked willingness to help find Karen. Now, she was certain she could identify him. So Miriam cut her hair and dyed it bright red to disguise herself. She wore an old government uniform from a past job at the health ministry and began going door to door in Sama's neighborhood, conducting fake surveys. Her mission was to gather as much information as possible about the man who had taken her daughter away. After piecing together her findings, Miriam took her evidence to the local authorities, desperately hoping they would offer their support. However, her journey quickly hit a massive roadblock. The crime rate in her city had skyrocketed, with shootings and kidnappings becoming the norm. 11 bodies had been reported, and more than 70,000 people were missing due to escalating cartel violence. The number of homicides in Mexico had doubled, yet no actions were taken to reduce the chaos. Law enforcement officers seemed indifferent to Miriam's problem, leaving her feeling utterly abandoned. A week passed with no movement on her request. Frustrated, Miriam started calling constantly, badgering the authorities for a warrant. When that yielded no results, she resorted to sending a formal letter pleading for justice. By the time investigators finally arrived at Sama's last known address, he had vanished, outsmarting Miriam in a way she never anticipated. While being frustrated, Miriam continued her relentless chase, identifying and tracking down more members of Sama's crew. Before long, she amassed a collection of photographs of Sama and his gang. A few months later, during Mexican Independence Day, Miriam's son, Luis, was closing his shop in Ciudad Victoria when he spotted a familiar figure, a slender man hiding inside. It was Sama. Recognizing him instantly, Luis dropped everything and called his mother while keeping a watchful eye on the kidnapper. The police quickly apprehended Sama, and under pressure, he began to release the names of his accomplices involved in Karen's abduction. One name stood out: Christian Jose Zapata Gonzalez, an 18-year-old who was soon brought in for questioning. Miriam observed the interrogation, and to her, Christian appeared to be a frightened child. In an unexpected act of compassion, Miriam approached Christian and offered him her lunch, even going out to buy him a drink. Touched by Miriam's empathy, Christian broke down and revealed everything he knew, including the location of Karen's body. Christian led the police to an abandoned ranch house near San Fernando, Tamaulipas, a site riddled with bullet holes, remnants of gunfight that had erupted months earlier. Among the debris lay a seat cushion from her daughter's truck, a horrifying confirmation of her worst fears. Despite forensic reports claiming that Karen's body had not been recovered at the ranch, Miriam refused to accept this terrifying reality. The evidence was undeniable, and her intuition told her otherwise. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. In 2015, a group of scientists confirmed the heartbreaking truth. Karen's remains were found at the ranch. After an extensive excavation of the area, where countless bodies had been uncovered, it was only Miriam's persistence that led to a second search. It was during this second effort that Karen's femur was finally discovered. As she drove home from the ranch, she passed a familiar barbecue restaurant where she and her eldest daughter, Azalea, had eaten just 2 days after Karen was abducted. She remembered a strange encounter there, running into Elvira Urissa Betancourt. Miriam had asked if she had seen Karen, but Elvira denied knowing anything. Something about the conversation didn't sit right with Miriam. Miriam started investigating Elvira. She soon discovered that Elvira was romantically involved with one of Karen's kidnappers, who was imprisoned at the time. Like she had done before, Miriam began stalking the prison during visiting hours, watching and waiting. By the time Elvia came for a visit, Miriam had her arrested. It was later uncovered that some of the ransom calls made to the Rodriguez family had come from Elvia's home. Once again, Miriam's intuition was right. Months passed, and Miriam continued her tireless pursuit. During her investigations, she came across a man named Enrique Joel Rubio Flores, a suspect in Karen's abduction. He had since turned his life around, or so it seemed. He had become a born-again Christian. Miriam traced Flores back to his hometown of Aldama and tracked down his grandmother, from whom she learned that he regularly attended church. Not one to miss an opportunity, Miriam began attending Mass at his church, keeping a close eye on him. Once she had gathered enough evidence, she contacted the authorities. On March 27, 2016, Miriam found herself hiding near the international bridge connecting Matamoros, Mexico and Brownsville, Texas, clutching a loaded .38 pistol. She lay in wait for the 9th name on her list, known only as the Florist. When he finally appeared, Miriam sprang into action, drawing her weapon and holding him at gunpoint until the police arrived. Rubio Flores, the 10th man involved in Karen's kidnapping, had relocated from San Fernando to start afresh as a pastor in Alamo. Using intel from his grandfather back in San Fernando, Miriam tracked him down and, alongside a few Mexican officers, successfully arrested him. In the 3 years since Karen's death, Miriam had also founded a support group for parents of kidnapped children called Los Desaparecidos de San Fernando, or the Vanished Collective of San Fernando. This small group developed into a network of over 600 members, all united in their grief and quest for justice. However, Miriam faced countless death threats from gang members and families of the very people she helped put behind bars. Close friends worried that she was crossing dangerous lines. On April 17th, Miriam set her sights on a woman who worked as a nanny in Ciudad Victoria. Once again, she stalked the family home for days until she finally spotted the young woman. When the nanny was arrested, Miriam was reported to have chased her on foot, sustaining injuries in the process. Tragically, on May 10th, 2017, Miriam Rodriguez was found dead outside her home. She had been shot 13 times by the very prisoners who had escaped from jail, the same men she had helped put away for abducting and killing her daughter. On the day she was murdered, police reported that Miriam was returning home to a small house where Karen once lived. As she parked her car and stepped out, a white Nissan truck pulled up beside her and opened fire, shooting her 13 times. Her husband found her lying on the street, one arm outstretched toward her purse, reaching for her pistol. Miriam succumbed to her injuries on the road to the hospital. Do you think she could have somehow escaped this tragic event if she was well protected? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section.